Hey folks, before the video starts, I want to say big thank you for the feedback you gave me in the last video. Again, I will be short and say, as every other video, to leave a like and hit the subscribe button. Also, don't forget to comment down below, helping me to give proof to YouTube that all of you who follow this channel so far are real people who watch my videos. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy. I'm a diver exploring the Titanic wreck. A dark web stream claims something lives down there. Yesterday, my submarine detected movement. So, this is a weird post for me to write. Normally, I'd keep this stuff to myself because, well, no one would believe me. But after what happened yesterday, I feel like I need to get it off my chest. Maybe it's paranoia. Maybe it's guilt for even watching that stupid stream. But here I am. I've been a professional deep sea diver for almost a decade. If you're picturing me as some rugged adventurer type, calm down. I'm just a regular dude with a love for history and an unhealthy tolerance for tight spaces. Diving is my job, but it's also my escape. There's something about the silence of the ocean, the weightlessness, the sense that you're somewhere almost no one else has ever been. It's peaceful, or at least it was. This past month, I landed what I thought was the gig of a lifetime, a contract with a private exploration team to document the wreckage of the Titanic. Yeah, that Titanic. I'm talking about the real deal, deep sea submersibles, cutting edge cameras, the works. We weren't just looking at the shipwreck for fun, either. This was a serious expedition, meant to assess how much the wreck had deteriorated over the years and what remained intact. For someone like me, this was bucket list stuff. Even if the conditions were harsh, pitch black, freezing cold, and 12,500 feet under the Atlantic, I didn't care. The thought of being there, seeing history frozen in time, made everything worth it. At least, that's what I thought. It started last week, during one of our off days between dives. We'd been working in shifts, taking turns piloting the submersibles and reviewing the footage. When my turn in the sub came up, I'd sit in the cramped little cockpit for hours, navigating the debris field, looking for any new details. It was repetitive, but amazing in its own way. The last week, one of the younger crew members, a tech guy named Adam, pulled me aside during dinner. He had this sly grin on his face and said, "Hey, you ever checked out the dark web?" I laughed it off at first. "What? Like those creepypastas about hitmen for hire?" "No thanks." But he shook his head, looking more serious now. "No, I mean the weird stuff, like live streams of things no one should be seeing." He told me he'd found a stream buried on some sketchy site that claimed to be a live feed from the Titanic wreck, except it wasn't showing us or any official exploration team. The footage was grainy and unsteady, like it was coming from a cheap underwater drone, and whoever was running the stream wasn't just looking at the wreck, they were narrating, whispering, actually. According to Adam, the stream's host had been talking about something unnatural living down there, some presence that wasn't human. I'll admit, I rolled my eyes at first. I figured it was some bored teenager in his mom's basement, rehashing urban legends. But Adam swore up and down that the footage looked authentic. They even showed the bow of the ship, he said. "It's legit, dude." Against my better judgment, I let him show me the stream on his laptop that night. The site looked like it had been coded in the 90s. Clunky black background, neon green text, glitchy pop-ups that my antivirus hated. The feed itself was low res, with heavy static interference, but I recognized the location immediately. It was the Titanic. The drone's camera panned across the ship's massive hull, now warped and encrusted with decades of rusticles. The footage had that eerie, slow drift to it, like the drone operator was taking their sweet time exploring every inch. The longer I watched, the more uneasy I felt. Not because of the wreck itself. I'd seen it up close during our dives, but because of the way the narrator was talking. The voice was a man's, low and gravelly, and it had this unnatural quality to it. He wasn't explaining the history of the Titanic or its sinking. He was whispering things like, "It watches, always watching," and "they never left." Not really. Adam kept nudging me, saying, "See? This guy knows stuff. He said he's been diving down here for years, way before any of us got clearance." But that didn't make sense. No one can just dive to the Titanic. You'd need millions in equipment, not to mention permits. Either this guy was lying, or he had access to resources no normal person should. Then, something happened on the stream that made my stomach drop. The drone camera jerked suddenly, as if something had hit it. The feed glitched, distorting into static before stabilizing again. When it came back, the narrator whispered, "It's moving. It's coming closer." I told Adam to shut it off after that. I didn't want to hear any more. I brushed it off as a hoax, some elaborate prank meant to scare people like us. But deep down, it left a sour taste in my mouth. I kept seeing that static-filled feed in my head, hearing the way the guy whispered, "It's coming closer." Yesterday, I got back in the sub for another routine dive. My mission was simple: explore the aft section of the ship, document the propellers, and map out any structural changes since our last scan. I'd done dives like this a dozen times before, and they'd always been uneventful, peaceful even. But about 2 hours into the dive, I started noticing something off. The water was unusually murky, almost like there was silt being kicked up from somewhere. That didn't make sense. At this depth, the water's usually still as a grave. I figured it might have been a current stirring up debris, but then the sub's proximity alarm started beeping. The system uses sonar to detect objects nearby, rocks, wreckage, that kind of thing. It's not perfect, but it's reliable enough to keep me from accidentally smashing into anything. But this time, the sonar wasn't showing rocks or debris. It was showing movement. Something big was circling the sub. I sat there staring at the sonar screen, trying to keep my breathing steady. The movement wasn't erratic, like you'd expect from a school of fish or a piece of drifting debris. It was deliberate. The blip would move closer, then pause, hovering just at the edge of the sonar's range. Then it would shift again, circling, always just far enough that I couldn't see it through the sub's external cameras. I leaned forward, adjusting the camera angles and toggling the floodlights. The beams cut through the darkness, illuminating the murky water like a spotlight in fog. Rusty fragments of the Titanic's stern came into view. Twisted metal, collapsed railings, ghostly silhouettes of what used to be one of the grandest ships in history. But beyond the wreck, there was nothing but black, yet the sonar kept pinging. I tapped the monitor, as if that would somehow fix it. Maybe the system was glitching, I told myself. We'd had equipment malfunctions before, though nothing like this. But the way the sonar blip moved, it wasn't random. It felt alive. Like whatever it was, it knew I was there. And it was staying just out of reach. At first, I didn't want to radio the surface team. The last thing I wanted was to sound paranoid in front of my colleagues. Everyone on this crew was a professional, and I'd worked my ass off to get here. I couldn't just call them up and say, "Hey, something's moving out here, but I don't know what it is or where it went." I'd sound like a rookie on his first deep sea dive, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It was like being watched in a dark room, knowing someone's standing behind you, even if you can't see them. My skin prickled, my pulse hammering in my ears louder than the hum of the sub's engine. That's when I noticed something else. The water around the sub was still murky, almost unnaturally so, but now I could see faint particles floating by the cameras, tiny bits of rust, bits of sediment, and something else. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The particles moved strangely, like they were being drawn towards something, sucked into a current that shouldn't exist. "Maybe it's just a deep current," I muttered under my breath, though I didn't believe it. Currents don't behave like this. Not down here. Not at 12,500 feet, where the water's as calm as death. I tried to focus on my mission. The off section was just ahead, the Titanic's massive propellers looming out of the darkness. They were still eerily intact, their size enough to make you feel insignificant. I brought the sub closer, angling the cameras for a better shot. Then the lights flickered. Not a little flicker, either. Full-on blackout for half a second before they snapped back on. My stomach dropped. If the lights failed entirely, I'd be stuck in total darkness. And while the sub had emergency systems, the idea of sitting blind in the crushing depths of the Atlantic wasn't exactly comforting. I kept my hand steady on the controls, pretending the flicker hadn't rattled me. Just electrical interference, I told myself, though the words felt hollow. But even as I tried to focus on the task, the sonar kept pinging. Whatever was circling me was still there. Closer now. The proximity alarm went off again, louder this time. My heart jumped into my throat as I glanced at the sonar screen. The blip had moved in fast. Too fast. It was only about 20 meters away now, closing the gap. My fingers flew to the controls, spinning the sub around, floodlights sweeping the wreckage. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, something caused by the sub's lights hitting the wreckage at a weird angle. But as I squinted at the monitor, I realized it was moving. The shape was huge, at least the size of a bus, and its outline was wrong, uneven, like a mass of tendrils or limbs, constantly shifting and curling, too fluid to be machinery or debris. The light caught a glint of something slick and shiny, like wet stone or flesh, but before I could get a better look, it darted out of view, faster than anything that size should be able to move. My blood turned to ice. I couldn't explain what I'd just seen. It wasn't a fish, wasn't a squid, and it sure as hell wasn't anything man-made. It felt ancient, alien, like it didn't belong in our world. I reached for the radio. Screw looking stupid. I needed backup. But as I fumbled for the comm switch, the sub jolted, lurching sideways as if something had struck it. The whole cockpit shuddered, metal creaking under the pressure. I grabbed the console to steady myself, my ears ringing with the alarm blaring around me. "What the hell was that?" I shouted, knowing no one could hear me. I twisted the controls, trying to right the sub, but it was like something had latched onto it. The sonar screen flashed wildly, the blip now directly on top of me. My stomach churned as I glanced at the external cameras. For a split second, I thought I saw something. Dozens of dark, spindly shapes wrapping around the sub like vines. but the feed cut to static before I could make sense of it. The lights flickered again, longer this time. The cockpit plunged into near darkness, save for the dim glow of the instrument panel. My breathing was ragged now, the air inside feeling stifling despite the life support systems. I slammed the comms button. Control, this is Sub 1. I'm experiencing, I don't know, something. There's movement down here. Something's got the sub. My voice cracked, desperation leaking into my words. Do you copy? Static. Just static. I don't know how long I sat there, gripping the controls so tightly my knuckles went white. The sonar was dead now, just a blank screen with no sign of the blip. The external cameras were still out, and the lights flickered weakly, barely illuminating the wreck. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the sub stopped shaking. Whatever had grabbed me was gone. For a moment, I didn't move. I was too scared to. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the engine. My instincts screamed at me to get out of there, but I couldn't leave without completing the mission. If I bailed now, I'd have to explain why. And what could I even say? Oh, sorry. I saw something weird and panicked. But just as I reached for the controls to continue the dive, I heard it. A sound. Faint at first, but unmistakable. A low, guttural groan, like the creaking of metal under strain. Except it wasn't coming from the sub. It was coming from outside. And it wasn't the Titanic. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. Deep sea dives can mess with your senses. Disorientation, hallucinations, paranoia from the pressure and darkness. But no, this wasn't in my head. The sound was real. It started as a low groan, deep and resonant, like the world's largest door being pushed open underwater. It echoed through the sub's hull, vibrating through my bones. There was a strange rhythm to it, a cadence that didn't sound mechanical or random. It sounded almost alive, like something enormous was breathing, and it wanted me to know I wasn't alone. The noise wasn't coming from the Titanic. I could hear the difference. The ship's wreckage creaks and groans from the pressure all the time, but they're sharp, metallic, unmistakably inanimate. This sound had depth, resonance, like it was traveling through water from something massive, something alive. I stayed frozen in my seat, clutching the controls so tightly, my hands were shaking. My training was screaming at me to remain calm, to focus on procedure, but my gut was in full-blown panic mode. Every instinct told me to get the hell out of there, but I couldn't just leave. The mission wasn't complete, and abandoning it would mean answering questions I couldn't afford to answer, questions I didn't have answers for. Instead, I forced myself to do the only thing I could. Look. I switched the external cameras back on. The monitors flickered to life, static crawling across the screens, but the feed was unstable. The lights outside the sub were dim, barely penetrating the murk, but I could make out the jagged outline of the Titanic's propellers. The wreck was silent now, a ghostly silhouette in the void. Then, something moved. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of motion at the edge of the camera's range. I leaned closer, squinting at the screen, trying to figure out what I was seeing. The water seemed to ripple, as if disturbed by an invisible current, but there was no current this deep. There shouldn't be. I toggled the floodlights to full power. The beams cut through the darkness, illuminating the debris field below. The Titanic's stern loomed ahead, its corroded metal gleaming faintly in the artificial light. But just beyond it, in the blackness, something shifted again. It was large, bigger than anything I'd seen down here before, bigger than a whale, bigger than the sub itself. Its outline was hard to make out, more a suggestion of shape than a solid form. The light barely touched it, as if the water around it was absorbing the beams, swallowing them whole. Then the groan came again, louder this time, closer. My ears popped from the pressure, the sound vibrating through the sub. It was a sound you felt more than heard, primal and ancient, like the earth itself was groaning in pain. I toggled the comms again, my voice shaky. "Control, this is Sub 1. Do you read me? Over." More static. I tried again. "Control, I'm detecting movement down here. Something large. It's not the wreck. Do you copy?" Still nothing. Either the depth was interfering with the signal, or something else was. Something intentional. The groan came again, but this time it was followed by another sound. A low, rhythmic clicking, almost like a sonar ping, but organic. It echoed through the sub, faster and louder than before, like whatever was out there was calling to something, or someone. I couldn't take it anymore. I spun the sub around, floodlights sweeping the wreckage as I searched for the source of the noise. The cameras flickered, static crackling across the feed, but I managed to catch a glimpse of something moving in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the light, but as I stared, the shape became clearer. It was massive, its form shifting and undulating like it was alive. Tendrils or limbs extended from its body, writhing and curling as it moved through the water with an unnatural grace. Its surface was slick and reflective, almost translucent, like a deep-sea jellyfish, but far more solid. Then it turned toward me. I don't know how to describe what I saw next, but I'll try. The creature, or whatever it was, had something like a head, though its features were indistinct. But I swear, I saw eyes. Not normal eyes, though. These were hollow, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light, like twin lanterns burning in the abyss. They locked onto the sub, unblinking, and I felt a chill run down my spine. It was watching me. The proximity alarm blared again, jolting me out of my trance. I glanced at the sonar. Whatever this thing was, it was moving toward me now, closing the distance fast. My hands flew to the controls, panic taking over as I tried to back the sub away. The creature didn't stop. Its movements were too fluid, too deliberate, like it knew exactly what it was doing. The water around it seemed to ripple unnaturally, distorting the light and warping the wreckage in the background. Then, as the sub started to retreat, the lights flickered again. This time, they didn't come back on. The cockpit plunged into darkness, the only illumination coming from the dim glow of the instrument panel. My breathing was ragged now, the air inside the sub feeling thick and suffocating. I tried to steady my hands on the controls, but my whole body was trembling. Then came the sound I'll never forget. A deep, resonant thud, like something massive had struck the sub. The whole cockpit shuddered, metal groaning under the strain. I felt the sub tilt sideways, the sudden force nearly throwing me out of my seat. Come on, I muttered, frantically trying to stabilize the craft, but the controls weren't responding. The sub was spinning now, dragged by some invisible force, the external cameras showing only static. Another thud, louder this time. The sub jolted violently, and I heard the unmistakable sound of something scraping against the hull. A deep, grinding noise, like claws on metal. That's when I realized the truth. This thing wasn't just watching me. It was trying to get inside. I don't know how to explain what happened next without sounding insane. Maybe I am, Maybe the pressure, the isolation, the fear, it all finally broke me. But I swear on everything I've ever cared about, what I'm about to tell you is real. The scraping against the hull was rhythmic, almost methodical. It wasn't random or frantic, like a predator testing its prey. It was deliberate, slow, as if this thing was feeling its way across the sub, searching for a way in. The sound was deep, resonant, and it sent vibrations through the cockpit. Every groan of the metal made my teeth ache, like the sound was crawling inside me. I was trapped. The sub was dead in the water, the engines unresponsive, the lights out except for the faint glow of the emergency panel. Even the external cameras had gone offline, leaving me blind to whatever was out there. But I could feel it. The way the sub rocked gently, like it was caught in the wake of something massive moving just outside. The way the scraping seemed to shift, coming from different parts of the hull, as if the thing was circling me, studying me, testing the limits of my fragile little cocoon. I gritted my teeth and forced myself to focus. The sub had emergency protocols for a reason, and I wasn't about to give up without a fight. I flipped open the cover on the manual override switch and pulled it. The backup systems kicked in with a low hum, and the floodlights flickered back on. For a moment, I could see again. The Titanic's stern loomed in the distance, silent and lifeless, a rusted tomb for the 1,500 souls who had gone down with her. The debris field stretched out below, a graveyard of shattered dreams frozen in time. It should have been a comforting sight, something familiar to ground me, but it wasn't, because just outside the range of the lights, I saw it again. The thing was massive, far larger than I'd realized before. Its shape was impossible to define, like it didn't fully exist in this reality. Its body seemed to shift and ripple, parts of it fading into the darkness as if the water itself was consuming it. The tendrils I'd seen earlier were longer now, more defined, writhing and curling like living shadows. They moved independently, each one with a terrifying purpose. And the eyes. God, those eyes. They were still there, twin orbs of faint, ghostly light that burned in the abyss. They weren't just watching me anymore. They were boring into me, piercing through the layers of steel and glass like they could see straight into my soul. I hit the thrusters, trying to put distance between me and the creature. The sub jolted forward, the engines whining in protest as they struggled to respond. The proximity alarm blared again, a shrill reminder that I wasn't alone. The creature moved with me. It didn't swim, not in the way a fish or even a squid would. It glided, its body undulating like smoke underwater, effortlessly keeping pace. The tendrils extended toward the sub, each one moving with a terrifying grace. They didn't touch me, not yet, but they came close enough that I could see the way they shimmered in the light, like oil on water. I twisted the sub around, trying to navigate through the debris field. Pieces of the Titanic's wreckage loomed all around me. Twisted beams, broken railings, chunks of hull plating, but I barely noticed them. My focus was entirely on the creature. It was hurting me. I don't know how I knew, but I could feel it. The way it moved, the way it positioned itself, cutting off my escape routes. It wasn't attacking outright. It didn't need to. It was steering me, guiding me deeper into the wreck. I tried the comms again, my voice shaking. Control, this is Sub 1. Emergency. Something's down here. I don't know what it is, but it's huge. Do you copy? Over. Nothing but static. I slammed the controls in frustration, my pulse pounding in my ears. My oxygen supply was still stable, but my heart was racing so fast, it felt like I couldn't breathe. I needed to get out of there. I needed to find a way to the surface. But then the lights flickered again. This time, they didn't go out completely. Instead, they dimmed, casting long, distorted shadows across the wreck. The water seemed darker now, thicker, like the abyss itself was closing in. The creature was closer, its massive form almost filling the screen. The tendrils brushed against the sub now, scraping softly against the hull, as if testing its strength. The sound made my skin crawl, and then I heard something new. A voice. It was faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the subsystems and the groaning of the wreck, but it was there, unmistakable. A low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, all at once. The words were indistinct, like a language I couldn't understand, but they carried a weight, a pressure that made my chest tighten. I tried to tell myself it was just the currents, the sounds of the deep twisting in my mind, but the voice grew louder, more insistent, until it drowned out everything else. It wasn't just speaking, it was calling. To me. I fought the urge to scream. I needed to stay focused, needed to find a way out. The emergency systems had a failsafe, a high-powered burst from the thrusters meant to dislodge the sub if it got stuck. It wasn't designed for this, but it was my only shot. I hit the button. The sub lurched forward with a sudden burst of speed, the engines roaring as they expelled a massive plume of water behind me. The force sent the sub hurtling away from the creature, the tendrils recoiling as the sudden current disrupted them. For a moment, I thought I was free, but then the groan came again, louder than ever, shaking the sub to its core. The water around me seemed to ripple violently, the lights flickering as if the darkness itself was fighting back. I glanced at the sonar and felt my stomach drop. The creature wasn't alone. To my horror, more shapes began to appear on the sonar, each one as massive and unnatural as the first. They came from all directions, emerging from the blackness like phantoms. The water around the wreck seemed to pulse with life, as if the abyss itself was awakening. The whispers grew louder. I couldn't take it anymore. I hit the thrusters again, pushing the sub to its limits as I tried to escape. The wreck blurred past me, the massive hull of the Titanic fading into the distance. The sonar screen was a mess of signals now, overlapping blips that moved too fast to track. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispers stopped. The sonar went blank, the lights stabilized, the water was still. I let out a shaky breath, my hands trembling on the controls. Had I escaped? Was it over? But as I stared at the monitor, something new appeared. A single word, scrawled in jagged letters across the screen, as if it had been etched into the feed itself. Stay. I froze, staring at the screen. The word stay flickered on the monitor, its jagged letters looking like they'd been carved into the display with something sharp. But that wasn't possible. The subsystems weren't connected to anything external, and there was no way a physical object could have reached the inside of the console. Unless... No, I didn't want to finish that thought. The sonar remained blank. The creature, the tendrils, the horrifying mass. It was gone. So were the others I'd seen circling the wreck. For the first time in what felt like hours, everything was still. The water was calm. The Titanic sat silently below, and the abyss above me was nothing but darkness. But the word remained. Stay. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the thrusters. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to leave, to get the hell out of the water before anything else happened. But something about that message gnawed at me. It wasn't just a warning. It felt like a command, a desperate plea, like someone or something was trying to stop me from making a fatal mistake. What mistake, though? Staying here was the mistake. That's what I told myself as I gripped the controls, forcing my trembling fingers to obey. I wasn't about to stick around to find out who or what had scrawled that word into my system. I pushed the thrusters forward. The sub lurched, groaning, as the engines strained to climb back toward the surface. My oxygen levels were fine, but I knew the pressure on the hull wouldn't hold forever if anything else decided to grab me. I kept my eyes glued to the monitors, watching for any sign of movement, but the cameras showed nothing but black. The comms crackled. My breath caught. "Control! Is that you?" I said, my voice raw and desperate. The static thickened, and for a moment, I thought I could hear faint voices in the noise. But they weren't my team. The words were indistinct, guttural, the same unnatural cadence as the whispers I'd heard before. It wasn't coming from the surface. It was coming from the water. I slammed the comms off and focused on climbing. The depth meter ticked upward, painfully slow. My eyes flicked between the sonar, the cameras, and the controls, half expecting the creature or creatures to reappear at any second. Then the sub jolted. It wasn't violent, not like before. It felt more like a tug, a sudden shift, as if the sub had hit a pocket of current. But there shouldn't have been a current this deep, and the proximity alarm remained silent. I tightened my grip on the controls, heart pounding as I tried to figure out what was happening. The lights flickered again, and for just a moment I saw it. Not the creature, not exactly, but something, a shadow, impossibly large, passing beneath the submarine. It wasn't moving toward me this time. It was descending, falling back toward the wreck, its tendrils trailing behind it like smoke in water. It was leaving, and it wasn't alone. As the shadow vanished into the depths, I saw them. Dozens of shapes, faint outlines in the darkness, moving toward the wreck. They weren't as large as the first one, but they were just as unnatural, their forms shifting and rippling like they were made of liquid shadow. They swarmed around the Titanic, their movements coordinated, purposeful. It wasn't random. They were gathering. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing through the cockpit, even though the comms were off. I couldn't understand the words, but they carried a weight, a sense of urgency that made my skin crawl. It was like 1,000 voices speaking at once, all overlapping, all driving one message into my mind. "You don't belong here." I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed the thrusters to full power, pushing the sub harder than I ever had before. The engines roared, the depth meter ticking upward faster now. The wreck disappeared beneath me, swallowed by the void, and still the whispers followed. The water grew clearer as I ascended, the crushing blackness fading to a lighter blue as I approached the surface. The pressure eased, the hull creaking less with each passing second. But the feeling of being watched never left me. Then the sonar beeped. I glanced at the screen, expecting to see a single blip, a fish maybe, or a stray piece of debris. But what I saw made my stomach drop. The screen was full, blips everywhere, hundreds of them, all clustered together. They weren't moving, not toward me or away from me. They were just there, hovering in the water, waiting. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now. I could barely think, barely focus on the controls. My vision blurred, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the thruster levers. The sub groaned, the sound blending with the whispers, until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. And then, all at once, everything stopped. The whispers, the sonar, the sub's alarms, even the sound of the engine seemed to fade, leaving me in total, crushing silence. I looked at the cameras, my breath hitching in my throat. They were there, not in the distance, not on the edge of the light. They were everywhere, surrounding the sub, their massive, shifting forms pressing in from all sides. The tendrils writhed, brushing against the hull, leaving faint scratches on the glass. The eyes glowed faintly, unblinking, staring directly at me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare back, frozen as the creatures surrounded me. The whispers returned, softer now, almost gentle. But they weren't angry anymore. They were sad. Leave. The word appeared again on the screen, flickering faintly before fading into darkness. The creatures began to move, slowly retreating, their massive forms melting back into the abyss. One by one, they disappeared, until only the largest remained. It lingered, its glowing eyes locked on mine, as if it was trying to tell me something. And then, with a final groan that shook the sub, it turned and vanished into the deep. I don't remember the rest of the ascent. The next thing I knew, I was being pulled out of the water, my team crowding around me, their voices a blur of questions and panic. I couldn't answer them. I couldn't even speak. The sub was damaged, the hull scratched and dented in ways no one could explain. The cameras were fried, the data corrupted, but the depth log was intact, and it showed the truth. I hadn't just gone to the Titanic. I'd gone deeper, much deeper. I don't know what I saw down there. I don't think I ever will, but I haven't slept since I came back, and every time I close my eyes, I hear the whispers. I see those eyes staring at me from the dark, warning me, not about what's down there, but about what will happen if we go back. I'm an archaeologist in Peru. We found an ancient skeleton with a strange device embedded in its chest. The dark web says it's not from this planet. Alright, so before I dive into this, I need to explain a couple of things about my job. I'm an archaeologist, not the Indiana Jones type, I wish, but the kind that spends weeks brushing dirt off rocks, cataloging pottery fragments, and sometimes, if I'm lucky, unearthing something cool enough to make the news. Most of the time, my job isn't glamorous. It's painstaking, and honestly, pretty boring. But occasionally, very occasionally, something truly insane happens. That brings us to Peru. This past summer, I was working with a small team in a remote region of the Peruvian Andes. The area we were digging in was high up, like hard to breathe high, and scattered with ancient ruins that hadn't been thoroughly explored. Our funding came from a university grant that, truth be told, wasn't much, so we didn't have all the fancy tech you see in documentaries. Still, it was enough to get by, and we'd managed to map out a promising dig site near what looked like an old burial mound. By week 2, we'd started uncovering what we thought were ordinary burial remains, pottery shards, bone fragments, some metal trinkets. It was cool, but not revolutionary. Then one of the students on the team, a guy named Luca, called me over to check out a skeleton he'd found. At first glance, it seemed normal enough. It was human, an adult male, based on the skull and pelvis, and surprisingly well preserved for something we guessed was around 1,000 years old. But there was something off. The rib cage, right in the middle of the sternum, embedded in the bone, like it had grown there, was this metallic object. I remember kneeling next to the skeleton, brushing away dirt and debris, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. The object was roughly the size of a deck of cards, rectangular, but with rounded edges. It had a smooth, almost glassy surface, and there were faint markings on it, lines and symbols that didn't resemble any script I'd ever seen. It was impossible. This thing shouldn't have been there. Luca, hovering over my shoulder, asked what it was, but I didn't have an answer. I've seen ancient jewelry, tools, even the occasional ceremonial artifact. But this was different. It didn't look like anything from that time period, or honestly, any time period. We carefully removed the skeleton from the ground and brought it back to the lab tent to examine it further. I spent hours staring at the object, running my fingers over its smooth surface, trying to figure out how it got there. It didn't look like it had been placed in the chest posthumously. The bone had grown around it, almost like the guy had lived with it inside him. And that wasn't even the weirdest part. When the sun went down and the rest of the team turned in for the night, I stayed behind to take some photos and document the find. I had my laptop open, uploading the pictures to our database, when I noticed something. The object was glowing. It was faint, so faint that I almost convinced myself it was a trick of the light. But as I turned off the lanterns in the tent, it became undeniable. A soft, pulsating glow, like a heartbeat, coming from inside the object. Now, I know what you're thinking. Maybe it was some kind of ancient tech, right? Like a device the guy had swallowed or been buried with. But here's the thing. There's no way something like this should have been functional after 1,000 years. Hell, even modern tech wouldn't last that long without corroding or breaking down. I tried not to let my imagination run wild, but I couldn't help it. This felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to have found it. The next morning, I showed the glowing object to the team, but of course, it wasn't glowing anymore. They thought I was sleep-deprived and overworked, which, fair enough, I probably was, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. That night, I decided to dig deeper, literally. I used my phone to take some high-res pictures of the markings on the object and started researching them online. At first, I didn't find much. The symbols didn't match any known language or script, and Google was no help. I even tried uploading the images to a few archaeology forums, but all I got back were theories about alien artifacts and ancient astronaut nonsense. Then I made a mistake. I don't know what possessed me to do it. Curiosity, boredom, maybe just sheer desperation. But I started looking for answers on the dark web. If you've never been on the dark web, let me give you some advice. Don't. It's a rabbit hole of illegal marketplaces, creepy forums, and stuff you're better off not knowing about. But in the moment, it felt like my best shot. I posted the photos in a forum I'd heard about from a colleague, a place where conspiracy theorists and fringe archaeologists hung out. I didn't expect much, but within minutes, I got a reply. The user's name was Omega72, and their profile was practically empty. No bio, no history, nothing. Just a single message. This is not human technology. Message me for details. Okay, I'm going to stop here for now. I promise I'll explain everything that happened next in part 2, but just writing this out is giving me chills all over again. If anyone has theories, or if you've seen anything like this before, please let me know. Trust me when I say this. I've spent years digging up ancient artifacts, but whatever this is, It's not something we were supposed to find. I'll admit it. I hesitated before messaging Omega 72. Something about their reply gave me this sinking feeling, like I was opening a door that couldn't be shut. But the object in that skeleton's chest had me obsessed. I needed answers. So against every ounce of common sense, I messaged them. I kept it simple. What do you mean it's not human technology? What is it then? Seconds later, they responded. Seconds. Like they'd been waiting for me. Upload the photos here. Use this link. Do not share it anywhere else. They sent me a link to a private server. Now, I'm not totally naive. I knew better than to just click random links from strangers on the dark web. But something about this person felt different. They weren't asking for money or trying to scam me. They seemed serious, like they knew something I didn't. So I clicked. The server looked like a stripped-down forum, just a single thread titled Artifacts of Unknown Origin. There were photos, grainy images of objects that looked similar to what I'd found. Not identical, but close enough to make my stomach flip. One image caught my eye. It showed a small metallic cube covered in those same strange markings. The caption underneath read, "Recovered from a crash site, Siberia, 1972. Still active." Still active? My heart was pounding. I uploaded my own photos and typed out a brief description of where we'd found it. Within minutes, Omega 72 replied directly to my post. Where is the object now? I hesitated. Part of me wanted to lie, to say I didn't have it anymore. But I typed the truth before I could think better of it. It's still with us, in our field lab. We're in the Andes. What they said next still haunts me. Do not remove it from the site. Do not attempt to power it on. Do not let it be taken. Power it on? Taken? My head was spinning. I replied, demanding answers, but they stopped responding. Just like that, they vanished. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I couldn't focus on my work. Every time I looked at the skeleton, I felt this strange mix of dread and fascination. I wasn't alone, either. Luca mentioned that he felt uneasy around the thing, like it was watching him. We decided to take a closer look at the object, using a portable X-ray scanner we brought for the dig. I wanted to see if it was attached to anything else, maybe some kind of wiring or mechanism inside the skeleton. That's when things got really weird. The X-ray showed something I still can't explain. The object wasn't just embedded in the ribcage. It had roots, thin, vein-like structures extended from the device into the surrounding bone, almost like it had been alive, like it had grown into the skeleton over time. Lucas swore under his breath, and I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't normal. Bones don't grow around metal, and metal doesn't grow into bones. We decided to stop for the night. Something about the whole situation felt wrong, like we were poking at something we weren't supposed to touch. That night, I woke up to a strange noise outside my tent. It was faint, almost like a low hum, and it seemed to be coming from the lab tent where we'd stored the skeleton. My first thought was that it was an animal. There were plenty of nocturnal creatures in the area, but as I listened, I realized the sound wasn't natural. It was rhythmic, almost mechanical. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The camp was eerily quiet, except for that hum. I made my way to the lab tent, and as I got closer, the sound grew louder. When I pulled back the flap, I froze. The object in the skeleton's chest was glowing again, but this time it was brighter, almost blinding. It pulsed with an intensity that filled the tent with a sickly greenish light, and the hum was coming from it. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, staring at the thing. Then, without warning, the light flickered and died, plunging the tent back into darkness. The hum stopped, and for a moment, all I could hear was my own ragged breathing. Then I heard footsteps. They weren't from anyone on my team. These were heavy, deliberate steps, crunching through the gravel just outside the tent. My blood ran cold. We were in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest village. No one should have been out there. I turned off my flashlight and crouched behind a table, my heart pounding so hard I thought whoever was outside would hear it. The footsteps stopped just outside the tent, and I could see the faint outline of a figure through the canvas. They stood there for what felt like an eternity. Then slowly, they unzipped the tent flap. I held my breath as the figure stepped inside. They were tall, too tall to be one of the locals, and dressed in what looked like a black tactical suit. Their face was obscured by some kind of helmet, and they carried a device that looked like a handheld scanner. They ignored everything else in the tent. Their attention was fixed on the skeleton. I don't know what possessed me to do it. Maybe adrenaline, maybe fear, but I grabbed a metal rod from the table and swung it at the figure's head. It connected with a dull clang, but they didn't go down. They barely even flinched. The figure turned toward me, and for the first time, I saw their face, or rather, their lack of one. Their helmet was smooth and featureless, like a blank slate, but as I stared, it began to shift. A faint, distorted image appeared on the surface, my own face, staring back at me. That was enough. I bolted out of the tent and ran as fast as I could toward the rest of the camp. Behind me, I could hear the figure moving, but they didn't run after me. They didn't need to. When I looked back, they were just standing there, watching me. And in their hand, the object from the skeleton's chest was glowing brighter than ever. I don't know what that thing was, or who, or what that figure was. But one thing is clear. This wasn't just an ancient artifact. It was something else, something dangerous. I'll explain what happened next in part 3, but let me leave you with this. If you ever find something that doesn't feel like it belongs, leave it where it is. You don't want to know what's out there looking for it. The figure didn't chase me. They didn't need to. That's the part that keeps replaying in my head. The fact that they just stood there, holding that glowing device, watching as I stumbled away into the dark like a terrified animal. It wasn't the act of someone who felt threatened. It was the act of something that knew it was in control. When I got back to the camp, I practically tore Luca out of his sleeping bag. He woke up groggy and irritated until he saw the look on my face. "What's wrong?" he asked. I didn't even know how to start. The words came out in a jumble. The glowing object, the footsteps, the faceless figure. I could tell he didn't believe me, at least not at first. But the fear in my voice must have gotten through, because he grabbed a flashlight and followed me back to the lab tent. The skeleton was gone. Luca looked at me like I'd lost my mind. He muttered something about sleep deprivation and stress, said I'd probably imagined the whole thing. "Bones don't just get up and walk away," he said, trying to laugh it off. I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to. But the tent was trashed, tables overturned, equipment scattered, the ground torn up, like something heavy had been dragged out of there. And then there were the footprints. They weren't boot prints, like you'd expect from a person. They were elongated, with odd claw-like indentations. "You think that did it?" Luca asked, crouching over the prints. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that the skeleton was gone. The strange device was gone, and I wasn't crazy enough to believe this was just a coincidence. The next few hours were chaos. We woke the rest of the team and explained what had happened, or at least what I thought had happened. No one believed me. They thought the site had been raided by looters, which wasn't unheard of in remote digs like ours. But looters don't leave behind clawed footprints. By sunrise, we decided to call it in. The lead archaeologist on our project, Dr. Morales, was based in Lima, and I had to be the one to make the call. I tried to keep it professional, but my voice was shaking so bad, she picked up on it right away. "Calm down," she said. "Just tell me what happened." I explained everything, or most of it anyway. I left out the faceless figure and the glowing device. I knew how crazy it sounded. Instead, I said the skeleton had been stolen, probably by people looking to sell it on the black market. Dr. Morales promised to contact the local authorities and arrange for better security at the site. She told us to stay put until help arrived. That was the plan, but things didn't exactly go as planned. Around noon, I noticed something strange. My phone, which I'd been using to check in with Dr. Morales and update our files, suddenly stopped working. No signal. At first, I chalked it up to being in the middle of nowhere. But when I checked with the others, I realized none of our phones were working. Even the satellite radio we used for emergencies was dead. And then there was the drone. We'd been using a small drone to map out the area. It wasn't fancy, but it got the job done. That afternoon, Luca launched it to get an aerial view of the site, hoping to spot any signs of the looters. Didn't make it far. The drone barely made it 100 feet into the air before it started glitching. On the monitor, the video feed distorted into static, then cut out completely. Seconds later, the drone plummeted out of the sky. When we retrieved it, the thing was fried. Wires melted, battery dead. It didn't make sense. There was no storm, no high winds, no reason for it to fail. It was like something had shut it down. By nightfall, the team was on edge. No one said it out loud, but we all felt it, like we were being watched. Every sound, every shadow, felt like it was hiding something. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. Sometime around 3 a.m., I was sitting outside my tent, staring at the stars, when I saw it. A light. It was faint at first, just a distant glow on the horizon. But it grew brighter, pulsing in a way that made my stomach twist. It wasn't natural. It wasn't fire or a flashlight or anything I could explain. I called for Luca and the others, and we all stood there, watching as the light moved closer. It didn't flicker like a lantern or bounce like someone walking with a torch. It floated, smooth and deliberate, like it was scanning the landscape. And then it stopped. The light hovered about 100 yards from our camp, just beyond the edge of the dig site. We could barely make out its shape. A sphere, maybe the size of a small car, glowing with that same sickly green hue as the object in the skeleton's chest. "Is it a drone?" one of the students whispered. "No," Luca said. His voice was barely audible. "That's not a drone." We stood frozen, too terrified to move, as the light hovered there. Then, without warning, it dimmed and disappeared, leaving us in darkness. For a moment, no one said a word. Then we heard it, the sound of something moving through the camp. It wasn't footsteps this time. It was heavier, like metal scraping against the ground. I grabbed a flashlight, and shone it toward the noise, but the beam barely cut through the darkness. I could see shapes moving, shadows that didn't belong. One of the students screamed, and I turned just in time to see her being dragged into the darkness. We ran after her, but by the time we reached the spot where she'd been, she was gone. No footprints, no sign of a struggle, just empty space where she'd been standing. The only thing left behind was her flashlight, flickering weakly on the ground. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, we were packed and ready to leave. Dr. Morales had sent a jeep to pick us up, but when it arrived, the driver was pale and shaken. "There's something wrong with the road," he said. "What do you mean?" I asked. He just shook his head. "You'll see." The drive down the mountain was surreal. Every few miles, we saw strange things. Trees scorched as if by lightning, patches of earth that looked melted, and worst of all, animals, dead animals, their bodies twisted and burned. None of it made sense. When we finally reached the nearest village, I felt a wave of relief. But as we stepped out of the jeep, I noticed something chilling. The locals were watching us, their faces filled with a mix of fear and pity, like they knew. One old man approached me as we unloaded our gear. He spoke in Quechua, and though I didn't understand much, one word stuck with me: Akachaka. I asked the driver what it meant. "The Watchers," he said. "They come for what belongs to them. I don't know who or what they are, but they took the skeleton, they took the device, and they took one of us. Whatever they are, they're not human, and I'm terrified they're not done yet. I'll explain more in part 4. For now, just stay away from places that feel wrong. Trust me on this. Some things are better left buried." We left the village as soon as the jeep was repaired. None of us said it, but staying there felt dangerous, like lingering too long might draw them back. The driver, a man in his late 50s named Carlos, refused to look me in the eye the entire ride. He kept muttering under his breath in Quechua, but I caught fragments in Spanish. "No se puede escapar." You can't escape. I wanted to ask him what he meant, but I didn't have the courage. We reached the nearest city, Cusco, by nightfall. The plan was to report everything to the authorities. When we tried, it felt like we hit a wall. The local police listened politely as we described the looters who'd stolen the skeleton and kidnapped one of our team members, but their eyes glazed over when we mentioned the glowing light or the strange footprints. "They think we're crazy," Luca whispered to me. He wasn't wrong. The officer in charge said he'd file a report, but insisted that it was probably just an opportunistic robbery. "A lot of outsiders are drawn to these sites," he said, shrugging. "Artifacts like that can fetch a fortune on the black market." He didn't even ask about the missing student. By the time we got to our hotel, I was feeling worse than ever. Exhausted, frustrated, and still terrified. I holed up in my room and tried to piece together everything that had happened. I couldn't stop thinking about the light, the way it had hovered, watching us as if deciding what to do next. It wasn't random, it had purpose. I pulled out my laptop and started researching again. Not on the dark web this time. I wasn't ready to go back there, but on more obscure forums and archives. I looked up stories of strange artifacts, unexplained phenomena, and disappearances in the Andes. One thread caught my attention. It was buried deep in an old archive and written in broken English, but the details were eerily familiar. The post described a dig in the Peruvian mountains in the late 1980s. A team of archaeologists had uncovered a strange skeleton with metallic implants. Shortly after the discovery, the equipment started failing, and the team began experiencing unexplained phenomena. Lights in the sky, odd sounds, missing team members. The post ended abruptly, but there was a reply from another user. "It's not an artifact, it's a beacon." I couldn't sleep after reading that. My mind kept circling back to the object in the skeleton's chest. A beacon? Was that what it was? A signal calling something or someone to our location. It explained too much. The lights, the figures, the feeling that we were being watched. I wanted to believe it was just paranoia, but deep down, I knew better. Around 3 a.m., I heard a knock on my hotel room door. It was quiet at first, but persistent. At first, I thought it was Luca, but when I called out, no one answered. I opened the door, cautiously, and found nothing. No one in the hallway. Just the faint hum of the hotel's fluorescent lights. Then I looked down. There was a single piece of paper folded neatly on the floor. I picked it up and unfolded it with shaking hands. Scrawled in thick, uneven letters was a single sentence. "You were warned not to move it." I ran to Luca's room, pounding on his door until he let me in. He was half asleep and pissed off until I shoved the note in his face. "Who left this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I said, "but it wasn't there when I checked in." We spent the next hour searching the hotel for anyone suspicious. Nothing. The receptionist hadn't seen anyone come or go, and the security cameras covering the hallway outside my room completely blank between 2:30 and 3 a.m. The next morning, I was ready to pack it in and get out of Peru. I didn't care about the dig or the grant or the skeleton anymore. I just wanted to go home and pretend none of this had ever happened. But before we could leave, something else happened. Carlos, the driver, came to the hotel looking frantic. He pulled me aside, glancing over his shoulder like he expected someone to be watching. "You need to see this," he said. He led me to his Jeep and handed me a crumpled Polaroid photo. It showed the dig site, taken from a distance, but in the center of the image was a figure standing exactly where the skeleton had been uncovered. The figure was tall, taller than any human, and surrounded by a faint green glow. Its features were hard to make out, but it wasn't faceless like the figure I'd seen in the tent. Instead, its head seemed elongated, almost insect-like. "When did you take this?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "Last night," Carlos said. "I went back to see if there were any signs of the girl." "What did you find?" Carlos hesitated. Then he looked me dead in the eye and said, "The site is gone." At first, I didn't understand what he meant. "It's gone," he repeated. "The skeleton, the equipment, even the tents. It's like no one was ever there." The photo in my hand felt heavier somehow, like it was proof of something I couldn't admit to myself. We left Peru that evening. I didn't tell anyone else about the photo or the note. There was no point. Who would believe me? On the flight home, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the glowing figure from the Polaroid, its elongated head turning toward me. I've been back for a few weeks now, but the fear hasn't left. Every night, I wake up at exactly 3 a.m., convinced I hear footsteps outside my door. And the note? I burned it. But even now, I swear I can still feel it in my hand, like a phantom weight. I thought coming home would make me feel safe, but I was wrong. Whatever we uncovered in that dig site, it wasn't just an artifact. It was a signal. And I think someone, or something, is still listening. It's been 3 months since Peru. 3 months of trying to move on, of telling myself it's over, that what happened on that mountain was just an anomaly, an aberration I'll never have to face again. But deep down, I know better. The first few weeks back home were relatively quiet. I threw myself into work, stayed away from archaeological sites, and avoided any conversations about the dig. For the most part, it worked, but the nightmares never stopped. I dream about the dig site almost every night. Sometimes I'm back in the tent, staring at the skeleton with the glowing device embedded in its chest. Other times, I'm running from something I can't see but can feel. Something massive, ancient, and alive. It's always the same. I wake up at 3 a.m., drenched in sweat, my heart pounding like I've been sprinting for my life. But it's not just dreams anymore. It started with the static. About a month after returning home, I began noticing interference on my electronics. My phone would randomly buzz and glitch, even when I wasn't using it. My laptop screen would flicker, lines of distorted green text appearing for a split second before vanishing. At first, I blamed it on faulty hardware, but then it spread to other devices. My TV would turn itself on in the middle of the night, displaying nothing but static. The radio in my car would cut out, replaced by faint whispers I couldn't understand. And then there was the light. One night, I was walking home from a late shift at work when I saw it, a faint, greenish glow in the sky, hovering just above the horizon. It was distant at first, but as I walked, it seemed to follow me. No matter how many turns I took, no matter how fast I walked, the light stayed with me. I ran the last few blocks to my apartment, slammed the door shut, and locked every deadbolt. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, just waiting. The next day, I decided to reach out to someone who might understand. I went back through my notes from Peru and found the link to the dark web forum where I'd first spoken to Omega 72. I didn't want to, but I needed answers. The forum was still there, but my original thread was gone. In its place, there was a new thread, just a single line of text. It's not over. My hands were shaking as I clicked on it. Inside was a single message from Omega 72. They've marked you. Once you've seen them, you can't go back. Beneath that was a list of coordinates. I recognized one of them immediately, the location of the dig site in Peru. The others were scattered around the globe: Siberia, the Pacific Ocean, the Sahara Desert. My first instinct was to close the browser and pretend I hadn't seen it. But before I could, my screen flickered. For a split second, the thread disappeared, replaced by an image, a face, or what I thought was a face. It was blank and featureless, but I swear it was staring at me. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called Luca. I hadn't spoken to him since we'd left Peru, but I needed to know if he was experiencing the same things. He answered on the second ring, sounding groggy and paranoid. "Have you been seeing it too?" he asked, before I could even explain why I was calling. "The light?" I asked. "The light," he confirmed. "And other things." He told me about the footsteps he'd been hearing outside his apartment, the way his electronics kept failing, the sense that he was never really alone. "They don't want us talking," he said, his voice trembling. "They're listening. I can feel it." "Who?" I asked. He didn't answer. The call cut out abruptly, and when I tried calling back, all I got was static. A few days later, I learned Luca was gone. He didn't show up for work, didn't answer his phone, didn't contact anyone. His apartment was empty, like he'd just vanished. I knew better than to report it to the police. They wouldn't find anything. Whatever took Luca wasn't human. Now I'm scared it's my turn. Over the past week, the strange occurrences have gotten worse. The static is constant now, seeping into every device I own. The green light has appeared 3 more times, always just on the edge of my vision. And then, last night, I found something new. I was going through my photos from the dig, trying to piece together what we'd missed, when I noticed something in the background of one of the images. It was faint, almost hidden by the shadows, but there was no mistaking it. A figure, tall and faceless, standing just beyond the edge of the camp. I didn't see it when I took the photo, and no one else mentioned it at the time. But it was there. It had been there all along. I don't think there's anywhere left to run. The light appeared outside my window again last night, brighter than ever. It stayed there for hours, pulsing faintly, until the sun came up. I know they're coming. Whatever we found in Peru, whatever that object was, it wasn't meant for us. It belonged to them, and now they want it back. I don't know if this will reach anyone, but if you're reading this, please, listen to me. If you ever find something that doesn't make sense, something that feels wrong, leave it alone, because some things aren't meant to be uncovered, and some doors, once opened, can never be closed. I'm a scientist studying a glacier in Alaska. We found a body encased in ice, but it's still breathing. Hey Reddit, I've been lurking here forever, but this might be the first time I've ever felt like I needed to post something. I guess I just want to see if anyone's ever experienced something similar. Or maybe I just need to vent before I lose my mind. Anyway, here goes. I'm a glaciologist, which sounds cooler than it really is. Pun not intended, I swear. My job mostly involves trekking out to the middle of nowhere, Alaska, in the coldest, most desolate corners of the state, studying ice cores, measuring melting rates, all that fun stuff. It's not glamorous, but I've always loved it. There's something serene about glaciers. They're these ancient, monolithic forces of nature, silent witnesses to thousands of years of Earth's history. At least, I used to find them serene. This all started about 3 weeks ago. I was part of a small research team. Just me, Dr. Kemp, our project lead, and 2 graduate students, Aaron and Mike. We set up camp near the edge of a glacier called Hollow Reach. It's not a big name like the Mendenhall Glacier or anything, but it's remote, cold as hell, and the ice there is old, like ancient, perfect for our study. On the second day, we heard it, this deep, low crack that rolled through the valley like thunder. If you've ever been near a glacier, you know that's not unusual. Glaciers are always moving, groaning, shifting under their own weight. But this crack, this was louder, deeper. It made the ground shake under our feet, like an earthquake, but more hollow somehow. Like the glacier was angry. We wrote it off as ice calving, a big chunk breaking off somewhere. But that was just the first weird thing. The next morning, we went to investigate. The sound had come from a crevasse about half a mile from camp, so we hiked out with our gear. Aaron spotted it first, a massive new fissure running right through the glacier's surface, easily 30 feet wide at the top. It was jagged and uneven, like the ice had been ripped apart from the inside. I've seen a lot of ice in my time, but this didn't look right. The edges of the fissure weren't smooth, like you'd expect from a clean break. They were jagged, almost melted, like the ice had been burned away. But that didn't make sense. It was sub-zero out here. We weren't even near a volcanic zone. Maybe it's some kind of chemical reaction, Mike suggested, snapping pictures with his phone. Yeah? From what? Aaron shot back. Alien acid blood. We all laughed, but it was one of those awkward, nervous laughs. The kind that bubbles up when no one wants to admit they're spooked. When we peered into the crevasse, it was like staring into the throat of the earth. The crack went down deep, farther than our headlamps could reach. The ice down there was an eerie blue-green, glowing faintly in the sunlight. And that's when I saw it. Something dark lodged in the ice wall about 50 feet down. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but then it moved. Or at least, I thought it did. I blinked, and it was still, but my stomach churned anyway. Anyone else see that? I asked, my voice a little shakier than I'd have liked. See what? Dr. Kemp asked, leaning over the edge beside me. I pointed. There, something dark in the ice. Kemp squinted, adjusted his glasses. Huh, might just be sediment, or debris from... From what? Aaron interrupted. We're in the middle of nowhere. There's no debris out here. We decided to rappel down to get a better look. Kemp volunteered to stay topside, classic Kemp. So it was just me, Aaron, and Mike. The descent was slow, the ice walls slick and treacherous. I kept my eyes on the dark shape, watching as it grew larger and more distinct with every step. And then, about halfway down, Erin gasped. Holy sh! She caught herself, but I could hear the panic in her voice. What? I called up. It's a person. I thought she was joking, or maybe just mistaken, but when I reached her, I saw it too. A human figure, frozen in the ice. It was lying on its back, arms crossed over its chest, like it had been carefully placed there. The features were still clear despite the frost. A man, maybe in his 30s, with dark hair and a sharp jawline. He wasn't dressed for the cold either, just a thin, dark shirt and slacks, like he'd stepped out of an office meeting and wandered into the glacier by mistake. And then there were his eyes. Even through the ice, I could see them, open, staring straight up, wide and unblinking, like he'd been frozen in the middle of a scream. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the faint rise and fall of his chest. The second I realized the figure's chest was moving, my entire body went cold, and not from the glacier. My first instinct was that it had to be some kind of optical illusion. Maybe the ice was shifting as the sunlight hit it, creating the effect of movement. Maybe it was just the adrenaline making me see things that weren't there. But the longer I stared, the harder it was to deny. He was breathing. I glanced at Aaron and Mike, hoping for confirmation that I wasn't losing my mind. Aaron's face was pale, her jaw clenched so tight I thought she might crack a tooth. Mike, on the other hand, was staring wide-eyed, his mouth hanging open like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Are you seeing this? I finally whispered. My voice sounded thin and hollow against the walls of the crevasse. Neither of them answered. Mike just nodded slowly, while Aaron muttered something under her breath. I couldn't make it out, but from the way she crossed herself, I guessed it wasn't anything scientific. Dr. Kemp, of course, was still at the top of the crevasse, blissfully unaware of what we were looking at. I don't know why, but I didn't call out to him. Maybe I didn't want to sound crazy. Maybe I didn't want to draw attention to whatever this was. Instead, I reached out and touched the ice. It was colder than anything I'd ever felt, almost painful against my gloves. I half expected the figure to react, but he didn't move. His chest rose and fell in slow, shallow breaths, but that was it. No flinching, no blinking, just that eerie, mechanical rhythm, like his body was on autopilot. "Should we?" Mike began, but his voice cracked, and he had to clear his throat before starting again. "Should we dig him out?" Erin turned to him so fast I thought she might snap her neck. "Are you insane? We don't even know what this is. What if it's some kind of contamination? Or worse?" "Worse than what?" Mike shot back. "He's a guy, Erin. A living guy. We can't just leave him here." "Living might be a stretch," she snapped. Her voice was shaking now, her bravado starting to crack. "For all we know, this could be some kind of, I don't know, cryogenic experiment or..." "Cryogenics don't explain the breathing," I cut in, louder than I meant to. My voice echoed off the ice walls, and I winced. "Look, we can't just stand here arguing. Let's at least call Kemp down to take a look." I glanced up toward the top of the crevasse, expecting to see him leaning over the edge, but he wasn't there. The rope he'd been holding was slack, swaying gently in the breeze. "Kemp?" I called, my voice rising. No response, just the low whistle of the wind and the distant groaning of the glacier. Erin was already fumbling for the radio clipped to her belt. "Kemp, come in. Do you copy?" Static. She tried again, her voice growing more frantic with each attempt. "Doctor!" "Kemp, this isn't funny. Pick up." Nothing. Mike started climbing back up, muttering something about checking the camp. I wanted to follow him. I really did. But my feet felt rooted to the ice. I couldn't take my eyes off the man in the glacier. There was something wrong about him. Something beyond the breathing. It was his eyes. They hadn't moved, not even a flicker. But the longer I stared, the more certain I was that he could see us. I can't explain it, but I felt it. A weight, a pressure, like the kind you feel when someone's watching you from across a crowded room. Except this wasn't a room. It was a frozen crevasse, hundreds of miles from the nearest town. And this guy had been stuck here for, what? Decades? Centuries? Longer? The ice around him was ancient. The idea that he was even still intact, let alone alive, defied everything I knew about science, about reality. But there he was, staring up at me through the ice, his mouth frozen open in that silent scream. Mike was halfway up the rope when we heard it, a low, guttural noise that made my skin crawl. At first, I thought it was the glacier shifting again, but it wasn't. This sound was wet, organic, like something breathing through a clogged throat. It took me a second to realize it wasn't coming from the ice. It was coming from him. The man's chest rose sharply, his back arching against the ice. His mouth twitched, his jaw jerking like he was trying to speak. And then the noise came again, louder this time, a horrible, rasping groan that made my stomach flip. "Holy!" Erin started, but she didn't finish. She was backing away, her boots slipping on the ice, her face pale as a ghost. Mike froze mid-climb, staring down at us with wide, terrified eyes. "What the hell is happening?" "I don't know," I shouted back, my voice cracking. "Just keep climbing. Get Kemp." But before Mike could move, the man's eyes snapped to him. I swear to God, I'll never forget what happened next. The man's head turned. Not much, just enough to follow Mike's movement, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. His neck was stiff, like the ice was still holding him in place. But his eyes were locked on Mike now, unblinking and burning with a strange bluish light. "Get me out of here," he said. The voice wasn't human. It was deep, crackling, like two voices layered on top of each other. One a desperate whisper, the other a guttural growl. Mike froze. Erin let out a choked scream. And me? I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The man's lips barely moved, but the words kept coming, echoing through the crevasse, like a chorus of whispers. You don't know what's down here. You shouldn't have come. And then the ice began to crack. The crack started as a single sharp snap, like the sound of a tree branch breaking under heavy snow. For a split second, I thought it was just the ice beneath us settling, but then the fissure began to spread, thin, jagged lines racing outward from where the man was encased. It was as though the glacier itself was waking up, reacting to his voice. "Climb!" I screamed at Mike, snapping out of my trance. "Get to the top! Now!" Mike didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled up the rope like his life depended on it, which, to be fair, it probably did. Erin wasn't far behind, grabbing the rope and hauling herself up, hand over hand, muttering a stream of curses under her breath. I was about to follow when the man's voice stopped me. "You can't leave," he rasped, his head twisting slightly in my direction now. The ice around him groaned and shifted, the cracks spidering closer to where I stood. "It won't let you." The glacier felt alive, like a living, breathing organism beneath my feet. The ground vibrated with a deep, rhythmic pulse, almost like a heartbeat. My ears popped from the pressure change, and I staggered, trying to keep my balance on the unstable surface. "Who are you?" I shouted at the figure, though I wasn't sure why. It wasn't like I was expecting an answer, not a real one anyway. But he did answer. "Not who," he said, his voice splintering into that layered, inhuman growl again. "What?" The cracks reached his chest now, forming a jagged halo around him. The ice seemed to ripple, as if something was moving beneath its surface. Something big. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but nothing about this made sense. Not scientifically, not logically, not even in the wildest, most paranoid corners of my imagination. Behind me, Erin screamed. I turned just in time to see her lose her grip on the rope. She slipped, her boots skidding on the slick ice, and fell hard onto her back. "Help!" she cried, scrambling to get up, but the cracks were already racing toward her, spreading like wildfire across the glacier's surface. I lunged toward her without thinking, grabbing her by the arm and yanking her to her feet. "Go!" I shouted, shoving her toward the rope. "Climb!" She didn't argue this time. Her hands trembled as she grabbed the rope and started to ascend, her breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. But as she climbed, I felt it again. That weight, that presence. The man's eyes were on me now, locked onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach churn. His chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths, his lips twitching like he was struggling to speak. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice barely audible over the sound of the cracking ice. "It's already awake." Something shifted beneath the crevasse. The faint blue-green glow of the ice dimmed, replaced by a deeper, darker hue, almost black, but not quite. It pulsed faintly, like veins carrying blood through a living body. And then I saw it, a shadow moving beneath the surface, slow and serpentine. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could recognize. The glacier groaned again, louder this time, and I felt the ice beneath me start to give way. "Run!" Mike shouted from above, waving frantically for me to climb. He was already at the top, leaning over the edge, his face pale with terror. "Get out of there, man!" I hesitated for a split second. glancing back at the figure in the ice. The cracks had almost completely surrounded him now, and his breathing was faster, more ragged. For a moment, I thought I saw fear in his eyes, not for himself, but for me. "You can't leave," he said again, but this time his voice cracked, almost pleading. "It will follow you." The ground beneath me buckled, and I didn't wait to hear more. I grabbed the rope and started climbing as fast as I could, my hands slipping on the frozen fibers. My arms burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. The sound of the glacier splitting apart below me was all the motivation I needed. Just as I reached the top, the ice gave way completely. The fissure widened, swallowing the spot where I'd been standing just seconds ago. I collapsed onto solid ground, gasping for breath, and rolled onto my back to look down into the crevasse. What I saw still haunts me. The man was gone, or rather, the ice where he'd been encased was gone. In its place was a massive, gaping hole, a tunnel leading straight down into darkness. The faint blue glow was gone, replaced by that pulsing black light, and something was moving in the shadows. Something huge and formless, shifting just out of sight. "What the hell is that?" Erin whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," I admitted, sitting up and trying to steady my breathing. "But I think we need to get out of here, now." We ran back to camp, our footsteps crunching in the snow, our breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. Kemp was nowhere to be found, and his radio was still crackling with static. The whole camp felt wrong. Too quiet, too still. Even the wind had died down, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. "We need to call for evac," Mike said, pacing back and forth as he fiddled with the satellite phone. "This place isn't safe. We need to..." He stopped mid-sentence, staring at the phone with a look of confusion. "It's not working," he said, shaking it like that would somehow fix it. "There's no signal." "Satellite phones don't need a signal," Erin said, her voice rising with panic. "They connect directly to..." "I know how they work," Mike snapped, his voice cracking. "I'm telling you, it's not working." I didn't say anything. I was too busy staring at the glacier. From our camp, we had a clear view of the crevasse, or at least where it had been. The cracks had widened, spreading out like a spiderweb across the glacier's surface, and in the center of it all, the black light was growing brighter, pulsing in slow, steady beats. That's when I realized it wasn't just the glacier. The air was wrong now too. It felt heavier, denser, like we were suddenly underwater. My ears popped again, and a low hum began to vibrate through the ground, rising steadily in pitch. "We need to leave," I said, grabbing my pack and slinging it over my shoulder. "Forget the phone. Forget Kemp. We need to get out of here. Now." "What about Kemp?" Erin asked, her voice trembling. "We can't just leave him." I hesitated, guilt twisting in my gut. But before I could answer, the hum turned into a roar, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The glacier trembled, and a fissure opened just a few feet from our camp, splitting the ground in two. And then I saw it. Something was rising from the crevasse. It wasn't human. It wasn't even animal. It was a towering mass of shadow and ice, its form constantly shifting, like smoke trapped inside a glass jar. Its head, if you could even call it that, was featureless, save for two faint pinpoints of blue light that seemed to burn into my soul. It didn't move like a creature. It moved like a force, slow, deliberate, and unstoppable. I don't remember screaming, but I must have, because my throat was raw as we ran. I don't remember packing anything either. We just ran, leaving everything behind, the glacier groaning and shuddering beneath our feet as the thing followed us. It didn't make a sound. It didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough to fill me with a kind of primal terror I didn't even know I was capable of feeling. And as we fled into the wilderness, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't just running from it. We were running towards something worse. The trek away from the glacier should have been a relief, but it wasn't. Every step felt heavier than the last, like the air itself was pressing down on us. The thing, whatever it was, didn't chase us in the traditional sense. It didn't lunge or sprint or roar. It just loomed, a massive, shifting shadow that hovered at the edge of our vision. But it was there, always there, its presence a constant, gnawing pressure at the back of my mind. I could feel it watching, waiting, like a predator toying with its prey. We stuck to the snowfield, navigating as best we could with the limited daylight. Mike had a compass, but it spun uselessly, the needle twitching like it was caught in some kind of magnetic storm. That's when the whispers started. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic, like a chant being carried on the breeze. I couldn't make out the words. They were muffled, distant, and yet somehow still inside my head. "Do you hear that?" Erin asked, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded. So did Mike. None of us said anything more. We just kept moving. The whispers grew louder the farther we walked, and with them came a strange, almost metallic smell in the air. It reminded me of blood, but colder, sharper, like frozen iron. Every breath stung my lungs, and my head throbbed with a dull, pulsing ache. And then the ground shifted beneath us. It was subtle at first, just a soft vibration underfoot. But then the snow began to collapse, sinking into pockets of air hidden beneath the surface. Mike was the first to fall, disappearing up to his waist in an instant. He clawed at the snow, shouting for help, but Erin and I were already sinking too. "Hold on!" I yelled, reaching for his hand. The snow was like quicksand, dragging us down with every movement. It wasn't natural. I've seen avalanches. I've fallen into snow drifts. But this was different. The snow wasn't just collapsing. It was pulling. Mike screamed as he sank deeper, his legs disappearing completely. I grabbed his arm and heaved, but it was like something beneath the snow was holding him in place. His face twisted with terror, and I'll never forget what he said next. "It's got me," he gasped. "Something's got me." Before I could process what he meant, the snow beneath me gave way completely, and I was falling. It wasn't a long fall, maybe 10 or 15 feet, but I landed hard. The wind knocked from my lungs. I coughed, gasping for air, and looked around. We were in some kind of ice cavern. The walls glowed faintly with that same eerie blue-green light I'd seen in the crevasse earlier. The air was thick, humid, and heavy with that metallic scent. The cavern stretched endlessly in both directions, its ceiling arched like the inside of a cathedral. It didn't feel natural. None of this did. It felt constructed. Erin landed beside me with a thud, followed by Mike. He was pale, his eyes wide and darting, and his legs were smeared with something dark, something that looked like tar. "What is this place?" Erin asked, her voice trembling. Her words echoed off the icy walls, reverberating in strange, distorted tones. "I don't know," I admitted. My voice sounded wrong too, like it didn't belong to me. Mike was staring at the tar-like substance on his legs, his hands shaking as he tried to wipe it away. It grabbed me," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I felt it. It was pulling me down. Pulling you down to what? Erin snapped, her voice rising. She was trying to sound angry, but I could hear the fear underneath. Mike didn't answer. He just kept rubbing at his legs, his breathing shallow and uneven. The whispers were louder now, bouncing off the walls of the cavern like a choir of unseen voices. They weren't just inside my head anymore. They were all around us, echoing from the ice itself. And then, slowly, the words began to take shape. You shouldn't have come. The three of us froze. Erin's eyes were wide, her lips trembling as she mouthed the words silently. Mike dropped to his knees, clutching his head, and started muttering under his breath. Shut up, he said. Shut up, shut up, shut up. Mike, I said, stepping toward him. What's wrong? They're in my head, he gasped, rocking back and forth. They won't stop. They won't. His voice broke into a scream, and he collapsed onto the icy floor, writhing in pain. That's when the walls began to move. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. The blue-green glow shimmered and shifted, the ice rippling like water. But then I saw the shapes, dozens, maybe hundreds of them. They were human, or at least humanoid, their forms twisted and distorted, their faces frozen in silent agony. They weren't trapped in the ice. They were the ice. Their eyes opened, one by one, glowing faintly with that same blue light. They stared at us, unblinking, their mouths moving in unison as the whispers grew louder. You shouldn't have come. Erin grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. We need to go, she whispered. We need to get out of here. But there was no way out. The cavern stretched endlessly in both directions, and the walls were closing in, the shapes pressing closer. I could feel their cold breath on my skin, hear their whispers growing more frantic, more desperate. Mike was still on the ground, convulsing, his eyes rolled back in his head. I tried to lift him, but he was too heavy, his body limp and unresponsive. We can't leave him, I shouted, but Erin was already backing away, her eyes darting between the walls and the shadows. He's already gone, she screamed. Before I could argue, the ground beneath us began to shake. The ice groaned and cracked, and the cavern filled with a deafening roar. The blue-green light flared, blindingly bright, and for a moment, I thought the whole place was going to collapse. And then it rose. The thing from the crevasse, the shadowy mass of ice and darkness, emerged from the floor, its formless body towering over us. It moved like smoke, like liquid, its edges constantly shifting and dissolving. Its eyes locked onto me, burning with an intensity that made my skin crawl. And then it spoke, not in whispers this time, but in a voice that shook the entire cavern. You cannot leave. You are part of it now. When I woke up, I was lying on my back, staring up at a pale grey sky. The air was still and cold, heavy with a silence that felt unnatural. My body ached all over, and my head throbbed with a deep, relentless pulse, like something was trying to burrow its way into my skull. For a moment, I thought it had been a dream, a nightmare conjured by exhaustion and the unforgiving cold. But then I sat up, and I saw it. The glacier was gone. Not just the crevasse, not just the cracks, but the entire glacier. The massive, ancient ice field we'd been studying for weeks had vanished, leaving behind a barren expanse of jagged rock and snow. It looked as though it had never been there at all, like it had been erased from existence. My breath caught in my throat, and I scrambled to my feet, turning in frantic circles. The camp was gone too. Our tents, our equipment, even the flags we'd staked into the ground to mark the perimeter. There was nothing, just me, alone in an endless expanse of white and grey. And then I saw the footprints. They were faint, barely visible against the hard-packed snow, but they were there. A trail of boot prints leading away from where I stood, disappearing into the distance. I didn't know if they were mine, or Mike's, or Aaron's, or if they belonged to someone else entirely. But they were the only sign of life in the desolate wasteland, so I followed them. The wind picked up as I walked, whispering through the empty air like a distant voice. I tried to focus on the footprints, keeping my head down, but the whispers were persistent, slipping into my ears like icy fingers. You shouldn't have come. I gritted my teeth and kept walking. The footprints seemed endless, stretching on and on, leading me deeper into the white nothingness. I had no idea where I was or where I was going, but I didn't care. I just needed to find someone, anyone. After what felt like hours, I saw it, a figure in the distance. At first, I thought it was Aaron or Mike. The figure was tall and thin, wearing what looked like a heavy coat. But as I got closer, something about it felt off. Its movements were too stiff, too deliberate, like it was struggling to mimic the way a human should walk. "Hello," I called out, my voice hoarse and cracking from the cold. The figure didn't respond. It just kept walking, its head tilted slightly to one side, as though it was listening to something I couldn't hear. "Aaron? Mike?" I tried again, desperation creeping into my voice. I quickened my pace, closing the gap between us. The figure stopped abruptly. I froze. The air felt heavier now, thicker, and the whispers grew louder, surrounding me like a swarm of invisible insects. The figure turned to face me. It wasn't Aaron. It wasn't Mike. It wasn't human. Its body was vaguely humanoid, but its skin, if you could even call it that, was smooth and pale, like polished ice. Its eyes were deep, empty sockets, glowing faintly with that same blue-green light I'd seen in the crevasse. Its head tilted further, as though it were studying me, and its mouth opened slowly, revealing rows of jagged, translucent teeth. "Why are you here?" it asked, its voice echoing in my head rather than in the air. I stumbled back, my legs trembling. I don't know," I stammered. We were studying the glacier, and there is no glacier," it interrupted, taking a step closer. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet being yanked on invisible strings. "There never was." The words sent a shiver down my spine. I shook my head, backing away. "No, that's not true. We were here. We saw it. You found me." Its voice was louder now, more insistent, and the ground beneath my feet trembled slightly. "You woke it. You woke us." "Us," I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what it was saying. "What are you?" It didn't answer. Instead, it raised one of its hands, or what should have been a hand. The limb was elongated and spindly, its surface rippling like liquid ice. As it moved, the blue-green glow intensified, spreading across its body like veins of light. "We are the memory," it said, its voice almost reverent. "The memory of the ice, the memory of everything it has consumed." I wanted to run. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn and run as far and as fast as I could, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the creature's gaze. "You are part of it now," it said, taking another step toward me. "You will carry it with you." "No," I said, my voice shaking. "I don't understand. I don't—" "You will," it said, and then it touched me. The moment its hand, or whatever it was, made contact with my chest, my vision exploded into a kaleidoscope of light and sound. I saw flashes of the glacier, not as it had been, but as it had always been, a shifting living entity, ancient and sentient, consuming everything in its path. I saw people frozen in the ice, their faces twisted in terror, their memories absorbed into the glacier's endless archive. I saw cities swallowed by snow, civilizations buried and forgotten, their histories preserved in the ice for eternity. And I saw myself, trapped, screaming, sinking into the glacier's heart, my body consumed and my mind fractured into 1,000 pieces. When I woke up again, I was back in civilization. A rescue team found me wandering the tundra, delirious and half-frozen. They said I was the only survivor. They said there was no glacier, no sign of a camp, no evidence that anyone had ever been there. They chalked it up to a mental breakdown, a hallucination brought on by the extreme conditions. But they were wrong. I still hear the whispers, late at night, when the world is quiet. I still feel the weight of the glacier in my chest, a cold, unyielding presence that I can't escape. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see the figure again, standing in the distance, watching, waiting. The ice never forgets.